Hi, this is Drake Death. I'm going to do a quick overview of all the factions in the strategy game Rome Total War. There are 20 factions in Rome divided into 6 cultures. Each one has strengths and each one has weaknesses. Okay, let's start with the Roman factions. There are 4 Roman families, the Julii, Brutii, Scipii, and the Senate. The Romans are the only ones that have 2 sets of units, the pre-Marian and the post-Marian. For the early part of the game, you'll have a limited selection of units. You'll have excellent infantry, limited missiles, and very bad cavalry. When you build an Imperial Palace, you get an event called the Marius Reforms. This replaces your old units with a giant roster of legions. At this point, Roman infantry becomes the best in the game. They get powerful cavalry, and they have really good archers. After the Marius Reforms, you can't retrain your pre-Marian units. Each faction in the Romans is pretty much identical, but each one has its own unique type of gladiators. Okay, now let's cover the barbarian factions. There are 6 barbarian countries if you count the semi-civilized Iberians. Unlike the Romans, they are very diverse and they're not bound to one another. The Gauls are probably the most basic barbarian faction. They've got alright infantry, mediocre cavalry, and only 1 special unit. But this special unit are the Forester Warbands, who are the best archers in the game. The Germans are, in my opinion, the best barbarian faction. They have access to a phalanx unit, really good infantry, good cavalry support, but very limited missile units. Some of their units will cause a morale penalty in the units fighting them. Most of their roster is unique to the Germans, but they share a few units with other barbarians. The Britons are a very unique barbarian faction. They have reliable infantry, few long-range missile troops, and have chariots instead of cavalry. They're also the only faction that decides to cut off people's heads and throw them at you. The Dacians are an alright barbarian faction, but they tend to have money problems early on in the campaign. Their infantry selection is small but good, with plenty of supporting archers and a pretty generic barbarian cavalry force. The Scythians are different from the other barbarians in that they rely on cavalry and archers instead of infantry. They have only 1 mediocre infantry type, but a huge array of archers, cavalry, and missile cavalry. The Iberians, or Spanish, are a Carthage-influenced barbarian faction in Iberia. They have disorganized versions of Carthaginian infantry and cavalry, so their infantry selection is alright, and they have pretty bad cavalry support and very few missile types. Now let's see the Greeks. There are 4 Greek cultured factions, but their fighting styles influence other factions, and we'll look at those later. You're most likely to think about the Greek cities first. Greece has a great infantry selection consisting entirely of hoplites, and they also have Spartans. Their missile support is small, and their cavalry is pretty much non-existent. Basically, cavalry is to Greece as infantry is to Scythia. Macedon is a pretty fun faction to use, and they're also the homeland of Alexander the Great. They have access to phalanx type units, mostly pikemen, and have excellent cavalry support, but very few archers. They also have the coolest colors in the game. The Seleucid Empire is an extremely diverse faction. They have an array of phalanx units, strong cavalry, and imitation legions, but lack in great archers. They have access to chariots, heavily armored cataphracts, and elephants, but their chariots and elephants will run amok if they take too many fire arrows. Thrace is a pretty weird faction. They're like the love child of Dacia and Macedon, with phalanx units, some barbarian-ish troops, limited missiles, and almost no cavalry. Their family members look really cool in battle though. Now the Eastern factions. I lumped the Egyptian and Carthaginian culture in here because I can. There are 6 of these factions. First is Carthage. They're a good faction with reliable infantry, some of which are capable of phalanxes, and really good cavalry. They have no archers and have to make do with slingers and mercenary Cretians. Carthage also has access to elephant units. Next is Numidia. They're a pretty limited faction. They have really good missiles and the best javelin cavalry in the game, but extremely limited infantry. But among their infantry are imitations of the Roman legions, which they're not as good as the Romans, but they're worth having. Then is Egypt. You'll come to either love them or hate them. Their infantry is almost entirely phalanx based with almost no armor. They have some of the best archers in the game, chariots and mediocre cavalry. But thanks to their chariots on the campaign, they tend to turn the Middle East piss yellow after a while. Pontiffs. They are one of the Greek influence factions I mentioned earlier. Their generals have Greek names and they worship Greek gods. They have access to two kinds of phalanx infantry, strong cavalry including chariots, and good missile support. Armenia. They're one of the three factions with imitation legions, and they also have good but not diverse infantry as their cities grow, including phalanx capable heavy spearmen. They've got great cavalry including horse archers and cataphracts. And cataphract archers too. Finally, Parthia. They're the only true Eastern faction with powerful cavalry, powerful missile troops, extremely crappy infantry, and one type of elephant unit. Their infantry is the worst in the game, and if you try relying on them, you will fail miserably. The Parthians are also famous for destroying a Roman legion at the Battle of Carrhae, and their battle tactics in the game really reflect that with horse archers and cataphracts. So there you go. The rebels weren't included in this because, quite frankly, that'd be too much of a pain in the ass, and they crash your game when you play their campaign anyway. I might make more videos after this, going into more depth about each faction, but until then, so long.